Okay, welcome to Chapter 10 on psychological disorders. We've covered 8, and we've covered 7 and 8, and we've skipped over 9. I'm going to save that to the last couple weeks of the semester. We're going to cover 10 and 11 then as a pair, the psychological disorders, and then the treatments that we use to treat people, of course, with these psychological disorders. What do we mean when we talk about abnormal psychology or mental illness? Abnormal psychology, the application of psychological science to understanding and treating mental disorders. For hundreds of years, we had superstitious beliefs about people whose brains weren't working properly. We thought they were possessed by demons. It's only been in the last couple hundred years that we've understood that psychological problems can manifest themselves in physical symptoms. Every year, about 1 in 4 Americans are affected by a psychological disorder. That's a lot of people who are quite unhappy because their behavior and their lives have been disrupted by some kind of psychological issue that needs treatment. Psychological disorders are a recognizable set of symptoms or behavior that cause distress and interfere with personal functions. In other words, everybody gets the blues, but not everybody suffers from depression. Everybody gets nervous, but not everybody is diagnosed with anxiety. When we look at diagnosing mental illness, we look at a biopsychosocial model. What does that mean? It's biological, psychological, and social. Are we suffering physically? That's the biological part. Is there psychological distress? Thoughts that are obsessive or interfering with life? And social factors. In other words, are you not able to get along with other people? Are your relationships failing? Can you not hold a job? All of these are ways of understanding psychological disorders. They affect us in many different ways. Mental health workers talk about psychological disorders as psychological issues that are persistently harmful to us. Harmful thoughts, harmful feelings, harmful actions. Are we behaving in a way that is not good for us, or is potentially dangerous to the people around us, or is disruptive to our life, stopping us from doing, what we want to do, or is disruptive to our family or friends or, the people who are around us? What they sometimes talk about is the behavior deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional? If it's so far out of the ordinary and so distressful, if it's causing us so much psychological trauma and dysfunction, you're not able to get along, then we call it disordered. Deviant behaviors are behaviors that are outside of social norms. It may be normal to walk around naked at a nudist colony, but it's not normal to walk through the mall naked. So if somebody finds you doing that, they're going to think that there's something something that's going on with you that's not doing you any good. So deviant behaviors far outside the social norm. Screaming and yelling in a restaurant, running up and down the street, threatening people with a weapon. All of these things could be considered quite deviant. And if it's accompanied by distress, behavior that's harmful, for instance, not eating in a case of anorexia, or cutting. Some people who are depressed or anxious cut themselves or pull hair out. This is distressful behavior, obviously. In addition, if the behavior is dysfunctional, in other words, if it interferes with important areas of our life, if we're unable to hold a job, if we're unable to maintain a relationship, if you're losing relationships, if you find that the things that you used to do that brought you pleasure no longer do, then we can say maybe we need to look at some treatment, that maybe there's a mental illness happening here. It's not just somebody having a bad day or a bad week, that there's truly a psychological issue that needs to be addressed. Now, back in the bad old days, as I said, we were superstitious about people who exhibited behavior that was outside the norm. And we thought that people were possessed by demons or sent by the devil or some other, supernatural nonsense. Ancient treatments could include trephination, which was actually drilling holes in the skull to let the evil spirits escape. People who suffered from psychological disorders were often caged like animals. They were beaten, they were burned, castrated, bled, sprayed with hot water and cold water. It was essentially like being kept in a place that was like a dungeon or a human zoo. People were not treated well at all. Luckily, we've moved beyond that. Now, when professionals in the field need to diagnose, obviously for treatment purposes, but also to get paid by insurance, everything's about that these days, one of the tools that they use is this, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is a reference for health professionals, mental health professionals, to help them describe and diagnose psychological disorders. For each disorder included in the DSM, there's a set of diagnostic criteria. In other words, what symptoms have to be present and how long do they have to be present for us to call a behavior disordered. One of the things that is difficult for mental health professionals is that all of us feel depressed sometimes. All of us feel anxious sometimes. When do these things cross the line into behavior that's truly disordered, or when can we say someone is mentally ill? This is where the DSM and experience with clients comes in. Is someone just having a rough ride because they've had some loss in their life, or is someone in need of treatment and maybe even medication? When we talk about psychological disorders, mainly we're talking about anxiety and depression. We will talk a little bit about schizophrenia and some of the more serious mental disorders. Not that anxiety and depression aren't serious, but this is normally what a mental health professional is going to be treating. The anxiety disorders include general anxiety disorder, or GAD, panic disorder, phobias, and obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Now, in the latest DSM, the DSM-5, obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are no longer categorized as anxiety disorders. They have their own set of criteria, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about them as though they were part of this constellation of anxiety disorders that people can suffer from. The mood disorders are essentially come in two flavors: major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, where the person suffering alternates between a manic state and a deeply depressed state. We used to call that manic depression, but now we call it bipolar disorder. We're going to talk briefly about schizophrenia, and this is truly the darkest of the psychological disorders, a true break from reality for people who suffer from schizophrenia. There's an awful lot we don't know about it still. And then at the other end of the spectrum, a couple of disorders that there are people who dispute whether these are disorders or not. Antisocial personality or disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. Are these actual mental illnesses, or are they just people being jerks? It's up for you, I suppose, to decide on these things. But the symptoms for these are also listed in the DSM. And there are treatments. If you're married to a narcissist, or if you have people in your life who are have antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, you might need them to get treatment, or you might recognize some of these symptoms in yourself. Let's hope not. Generalized anxiety disorder. Let's start with the anxiety disorders. And this is a persistent and uncontrollable tenseness and apprehension. In other words, you feel anxious most of the time, and there doesn't seem to be a reason that you can pinpoint. You have autonomic arousal. In other words, your fight and flight response, that sympathetic nervous system response, is always on, or is mostly on, and you're unable to identify the cause of these feelings. It's just generalized. And the sympathetic nervous system is there as a survival tool for us, but it's not meant to be on all the time. And you can be drained, you can lack sleep, the immune system can be worn down by this constant fear of the next thing that's going to happen, whatever it may be. So this is GAD, or generalized anxiety disorder, and frequently treated with therapy and medication. Panic disorder is similar to generalized anxiety disorder, although oftentimes we know what brings on the panicky situation. Being in crowds or being in traffic or whatever, depends on what your particular fear is. And what happens is sometimes mistaken for a heart attack. These attacks, these panic attacks, which include feelings of intense dread, just deep, deep fear that you're going to die or something, just terrible is happening. You feel terrified, chest pains, choking, other, difficulty breathing, other symptoms or sensations that make people think that they're having a heart attack. Frequently, I can't remember what the percentage is, but a fair number of folks who go to the emergency room fearing that they are having a heart attack are suffering from panic attacks. So these are short, not as long lasting, of course, as generalized anxiety disorder, but quite intense, even though they may only last a few minutes. Some of these panic attacks can be brought on by phobias. And most people, I shouldn't say most people, many people have a phobia about something. And this is a persistent and irrational fear of a specific object or situation that, again, disrupts our lives, disrupts behavior. And typically phobias, the reason phobias are difficult to get over is because they generally come from a place that is rational. In other words, if you fear stormy weather, or you fear drowning, you can't go in the water, or you fear heights, or you fear blood, these are all quite reasonable. It's if you're in a situation where you're bleeding, that's not great. If you fear heights because you don't want to fall from a 10-story building, well, that's a reasonable thing. Phobias are when that fear has morphed into something paralyzing. Something that's stopping you from living your life, doing what you want to do. There are lots of kinds of phobias. Agoraphobia is fear of open spaces. The agora was the Greek word for the marketplace. So people who suffer from agoraphobia typically can't leave the house. Obviously, that's a problem. Acrophobia is a fear of heights. And that's a problem if you can't, climb up on a ladder to change a light bulb, or you can't, live on the second story of your house. Claustrophobia, people know this, fear of closed-in spaces. And again, this is a reasonable fear. You could be trapped, as in your cave, back in the cave days, and you don't want to be, buried alive or trapped in some deep, dark place. So claustrophobia is quite reasonable, except when it stops you from getting in an elevator. Hemophobia, fear of blood. So everybody's got, not everybody, but many people suffer from these phobias. I had an MRI a few years back, and they always ask you, are you claustrophobic? Because the MRI is this long tube that you sort of go in. And I said, I don't think so. I'd never thought about it before. Well, I was. They put me in that thing and I freaked out because you can't get out. It's like being in a tube, in a tomb. And that's a problem if you need an MRI and can't get one. They have open MRIs, but even those are pretty closed in. So I've had a little trouble over them, over the last few years. If I've needed that kind of, an MRI, I can get an X-ray fine, but I can't get the MRI. So these can, again, challenge us. We'll talk about treatments for each of these when we get to chapter 11. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. People with obsessive compulsive disorder typically are suffering from anxieties. And these are thoughts that they can't seem to shake. And usually these are about fear. Afraid to leave the house. Did I check all the locks? Did I turn off all the lights? Did I turn off the gas on the stove? And these thoughts, and we all have thoughts that sort of come into our head, sort of irrational thoughts. And usually we just don't pay attention to them and they sort of just pass. But people with obsessive compulsive disorder focus on these obsessions. And to ease their mind, to ease to calm the mind, they frequently turn to compulsive rituals in an attempt to then calm those repetitive thoughts. And these typically do reduce anxiety. Often people with OCD are fearful of germs. So there's a cleanliness obsession that happens. And they'll wash their hands 100 times a day. Now, it's reasonable to wash your hands a lot because we know that's how dreams are. Dreams. Wow, there's a Freudian slip. That's how germs are transferred. At school, I wash my hands a half a dozen times a day because so many people are coming through the building and touching surfaces. And that's okay. If you're washing your hands 100 times a day until the skin is cracked and bleeding, you have taken this too far. Now, if you fear germs and washing your hands calms that anxiety, great. But when those thoughts come back and you have to wash your hands again, and then they come back and you have to wash your hands again, there's this reinforcement that happens. You remember reinforcement, right? B.F. Skinner and his reinforcement. So washing your hands calms your fears, so you have to do it again. And then you do it again and again and again. And these things become a disorder when they really interrupt your life. People who have to shower or change their clothes 5 or 6 times a day, or they can't leave the house without checking all the locks. And there's often counting rituals that go along with these things. So you have to check each lock 3 times. And if you accidentally do it 4 times or 2 times, then you have to start your whole ritual over. Otherwise, you are unable to calm down. So again, this is no longer considered necessarily an anxiety disorder, but it's certainly in the anxiety disorder family. As I said, typically we're talking about obsessions with dirt, germs, or safety. Often symmetry or order is involved. Everything needs to be balanced. Everything needs to be in 2s or 3s. And the compulsions are often grooming or bathing or repeating rituals, counting rituals, checking rituals, doing everything in the same numbers, everything in 3s or everything in 5s, or as I said, checking all the locks. All of these things to calm our fears. And again, treatment is typically with therapy and medication. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I think we're mostly familiar with this because of the soldiers coming back from overseas now who have seen combat. But it can also occur in people who have suffered a trauma like sexual assault or sexual abuse, natural disasters, car wrecks, anything that sort of short circuits the sympathetic nervous system. Can cause us flashbacks, high levels of anxiety, depression. People can have a very difficult time trusting that the world is a safe place after they've had a trauma. 5 million Americans, upwards of 5 million Americans are affected by this. And it's a frequent outcome of sexual abuse. All of the things, the accusations that are coming out now about powerful men in Hollywood and in politics, women who have been assaulted or abused or suffered at the hands of these men are coming out 10, 15, 20 years later and saying, you know, my life was really affected by this. I still haven't been able to get over this. It's really post-traumatic stress. You've had a traumatic experience and it has affected you psychologically. We diagnose PTSD when we see 4 or more weeks of the following symptoms: haunting memories, in other words, you relive the experience over and over again; nightmares, an inability to sleep because of nightmares; social withdrawal, we don't want to go out in the world because we can't shake, you know, this sort of reliving this trauma; anxiety, sleep problems, etc. If you're a soldier coming back from overseas and IEDs were a big problem for you, you may be unable to drive down the street without seeing potential bombs everywhere, or you know, running for cover in the grocery store. These things are terrifying, and they're quite real to the person who is suffering. Again, we'll talk about treatment when we get to chapter 11. So where does anxiety come from? Well, as I said, it's quite reasonable. You know, our caveman ancestors did fear snakes and spiders and closed-in spaces. Anxiety and fear has survival value for us. And some people are genetically more wired up to be more emotionally reactive, to have nervous systems that do react to dangers around us, or perceived dangers. There is a genetic component for that. And honestly, if you are suffering from anxiety, your brain's doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to protect you from that saber-toothed tiger. It's not supposed to, protect you from the saber-toothed tiger in a grocery store, because mostly they aren't there. But that is what can happen when our caveman brain is trying to protect us, and this can lead to some psychological difficulties for us. So let's talk about depression. As I said before, there are 2 principal forms of mood disorders. One is major depressive disorder, and the other is bipolar disorder. They say that the depression is the common cold of psychological disorders. In other words, a lot of people suffer from depression, 7% in any given year in the United States. In major depressive disorder, when any of the following symptoms last more than 2 weeks, you're really getting, you're going from I'm having a bad day, bad week, I've got the blues, into maybe this is something I need to seek treatment for. Lethargy and fatigue. In other words, not just tired, but actual bone tired, can't get out of bed, can't get off the couch, fatigue. Feelings of worthlessness. There's no point in me going out and, going to school or doing my job or being with my friends because I just feel like I don't deserve any happiness or joy. Loss of interest in family and friends, and loss of interest in activities. If you have a friend and you used to go shopping or you used to go bowling or something, and they are no longer interested, you're no longer interested in things that used to give you pleasure, that's a sign that depression might be sneaking up on you. And this is something that we need to consider carefully, because, of course, the most severe behavioral response to depression is suicide. Every year, 1 million people plus in the world commit suicide. It's the second leading cause of death among those 15 to 24. In people in my age cohort, suicide is way up. And when you see, it's probably underreported. 41,000 people in the U.S. in 2013, more than auto crash fatalities. And I think it's probably underreported. Whenever I see a one-car accident, I'm always suspicious if that person committed suicide. Or when you see people who have drug overdoses or drink themselves to death, you do wonder how much of that was on purpose. Psychological issues are tricky, but suicide is always, of course, a poor choice and always tragic when it happens. If somebody that talks about this or as I said, has sort of removed themselves from, your circle, has retreated, you need to reach out to them because they may be suffering from depression. Bipolar disorder, we used to call manic depression, and this is when the sufferer alternates between depression and mania. Mania is, well, the depressive symptoms are what you would expect. The person is gloomy, withdrawn, lethargic, unmotivated, has lost interest in things that they used to be interested in. The manic symptoms are elation, euphoria, hyperactivity. People who are creative sometimes revel in their manic episodes. They love the feeling of the mania. They can stay up for days at a time. They spend money. They have sex. They jump on a plane and fly somewhere. If they are creative, they write or they paint. And this is what makes treating this difficult, because many people who suffer from bipolar disorder do not want to take the medication that takes away the mania, because that is, a peak experience for them. A lot of writers, poets, composers, etc. Suffered from this. Walt Whitman, Virginia Woolf, Mark Twain, and Ernest Hemingway all were bipolar. And when they were depressed, they were very depressed. And when they were working in the manic stage, they were quite creative and productive. But of course, the downside is, Hemingway killed himself with a shotgun. You don't want to be trapped inside that brain, even if it does mean you can write great novels. So for depression, where does it come from? Well, there's certainly a biological component. Depression does run in families. Mood disorders run in families. Neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine seem to be lacking in people who suffer from depression. So there is a genetic predisposition here. The rate of depression in identical twins is quite high, 50%. If your identical twin who has your exact same DNA has depression, you are certainly at risk. So there's that. The brains just don't seem to be producing the same amount of those good-feeling neurotransmitters. There's also a cognitive component. And what that means is 50% of those identical twins who are predisposed to depression don't get depression. What's going on with them? In many ways, and we'll talk about this again when we get to therapy, the cognitive psychologists say that it's what you tell yourself that can exacerbate symptoms of depression. For instance, if you are the person that insists on seeing the glass as half empty, in other words, you have a negative explanatory style, you can take what is maybe a bad day or a bad week and turn it into a full-on depressive state. If you see the dark side, if you insist on seeing the dark side of things, that will make you feel bad. And when you feel bad, you remember we talked about memories, mood congruent memories. When you feel blue, you're more finely attuned to the things in the environment that are negative, your negative memories, right? The negative things that have happened to you today. I mean, every day, everybody's day is a little bit of a cornucopia, a little bit of a fanfare. There's a little good, a little bad, a little whoever, and you can pick and choose as to what you recall and what you want to act on and what you want to think about. People who are stuck in a cycle of depression have, let's say, a stressful experience. They lose a job, or a loved one dies or moves away, and because of their negative explanatory style, the negative attributions that they make, they see the dark side, and that makes them feel blue. And when you feel blue, when you're a little bit down, maybe you don't go out so much. Maybe you don't exercise. Maybe you don't see people quite as much. Maybe you don't eat very well. And of course, that puts some stress on your body and on your immune system and causes you to feel worse. And then you focus on the negative, and then that makes you depressed, and then you feel blah, 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 blah. You can see this cycle. One of the things that cognitive behavioral therapists try to do in therapy is to break this cycle. So that's anxiety and depression, which brings us to schizophrenia. If you have viewed the Discovering Psychology clip with poor David Taggart, you've seen an example of paranoid schizophrenia. Schizophrenia literally means a split mind. In other words, a split from reality, disorganized and delusional thinking, disturbed perceptions, and a true loss of contact with reality, inappropriate emotions, and inappropriate actions that don't square with reality. Again, poor David thought he was being watched by someone. It's hard to look at him with his broken glasses and his broken teeth. Even though he had quite sophisticated vocabulary, it was clear that he was truly not in touch with reality. So one of the difficulties with schizophrenia is that it's a disease of the mind, and the symptoms are behavioral. I mean, this is true with all mental illnesses, but we say that the person has schizophrenia. We don't say that the person's brain has schizophrenia. And this is the difficulty with psychological illnesses. If you've got something wrong with your lungs or your heart or your kidneys, we don't say, that person is I guess we do say, that person is suffering from lung cancer, and their symptoms are they cough a lot or they have difficulty breathing. If you are suffering from a mental illness like schizophrenia, your symptoms are behavioral. You may run away. You may live on the street. You may be impossible to deal with. You might be very violent. There are treatments, but it's hard to keep a person who has schizophrenia in treatment. Frequently, they'll take their medication, they'll feel better, they'll say, well, I'm cured, they'll stop taking their medication, the next thing you know, they think they're being followed by aliens again. So a schizophrenic person may perceive things that aren't there, suffer from delusions or paranoia, or they may just sit in a corner and rock in a chair all day long in a kind of a catatonic state. So schizophrenia is a disease of the brain exhibited by symptoms of the mind. And this is what makes it so difficult to treat. Probably a third or so of people who suffer from schizophrenia can be treated quite successfully with medication. And as long as they take their medication, they're in good shape. They can function quite well in the world. A third of people can have their symptoms alleviated with medication, but need a little more help than that. They might need to live with, in a group home or have a caretaker of some kind. And a third of people simply need to be hospitalized because they don't respond to treatment and they truly are beyond the reach of medication and the mental health treatment community. And it's tragic. Often you'll see these people on the street talking to themselves. Obviously this is tragic. Schizophrenics express higher levels of dopamine in the brain, or dopamine receptors, don't know why. Genetics matter. Schizophrenia does run in families to a certain extent. It can be brought on by brain trauma, concussion, or brain damage through drug use. And this is obviously quite tragic as well. Finally, I want to talk about personality disorders. And again, these are mental illnesses that some people, these are some of the, when we talk about borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, I think there are people, this is one of the things where they look at psychology and say, aren't we just making stuff up now? But again, if one of these people is in your life, this is not pleasant for you or for your kids or for your relationship. Personality disorders are characterized by behavior patterns that impair social functioning. People who steal without remorse or don't seem to have empathy. They can, smile in your face and stab you in the back. Sometimes people can be very odd or eccentric, but oftentimes, in the case of, say, narcissistic personality disorder, they seem quite normal and even charming. But the overarching component of personality disorders seems to be a lack of empathy. Oftentimes, people who suffer from personality disorders like borderline personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder are great actors. They understand how to get what they want, even though they may actually lack the ability to put themselves in someone else's shoes. In other words, they're empathic to a certain extent. They know what you want to say, or they know what you want to hear, and they're able to say it. Sometimes borderline personality disorder people can be very unstable. These are the people who say, if you break up with me, I'm going to kill myself. The people who are outside your house at 2 a.m, banging on your door, screaming, why don't you love me anymore? Fear abandonment, clingy, dependent, etc. Insecure attachment. We talked about attachment. Remember Harlow and his monkeys? May be a cause. If they did not have secure attachment as an infant, they can, have these clingy, dependent behaviors. In many people who suffer from this, they have an overactive amygdala and a lack of executive function. So when most of us feel a powerful emotion, we're able to manage it. I'm very upset because you broke up with me. I'm going to sit at home and drink too much and listen to Frank Sinatra, and then I'll be fine. People who have borderline personality disorder freak out, sneak into your house with a pair of scissors and cut up all your clothes. So they're unable to manage that powerful emotion. In antisocial personality disorder, and this is Bernie Madoff, the guy who went to jail for bilking his friends and family out of millions of dollars, there seems to be, again, a lack of empathy, a lack of conscience for wrongdoing. Freud's superego had the conscience and the ego ideal, and it seems like these people lack a conscience. They are able to seduce you and dump you and not feel bad about it. Why are you calling me? I thought you loved me. No. Oh, I do love you. Come on over. And then, they'll use you and toss you aside again. They seem to have a disregard for the rights of other people. Sometimes violent, but often not. Often sociopaths or psychopaths, which is what we used to call these folks, can be quite charming. They're not all Jeffrey Dahmer. They're not all murderers. And they're not all going to jail like Bernie Madoff. Sometimes they're just users, manipulators. You feel like they're your best friend, or they're your lover, or they're your partner in your relationship, and then you realize that they are not having the same relationship with you that you're having with them. They're just getting what they want from you, and they don't see anything wrong with them. There seems, from what I've seen from people who do seem to have this antisocial personality, they're quite taken aback if you are angry with them. They're very surprised that your feelings are hurt or that you feel cheated or violated, and they don't know why they should feel guilty about just doing what everybody does. When, of course, everybody doesn't do what these folks do. They really do lack whatever that thing is that we all have that allows us to see, to have a theory of mind, to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and to treat them, as they would wish to be treated. And not take advantage of people. So these are the personality disorders. Are they a real thing, or are they people who are just jerks? It's up to you to decide about that. This chart's a little dated, goes back to 2002, but it does show you a general spread of disorders. Alcohol, we didn't talk about addictions, but 5% of the population, that's probably low. Generalized anxiety disorder, 4%. Phobias, 8% of us have phobias. OCD affects at least 2% of the population. 5% for mood disorders. I think that's low as well. But of course, Typically, men don't seek treatment. They just go to the bar and self-medicate with booze. Schizophrenia is probably holding steady at about 1% or 1.5% of the population. Antisocial personality disorders or any borderline personality disorder, again, probably 1% or 1.5% of the population. Some people have comorbidity. In other words, they suffer from two of these things at the same time. As I said, you suffer from depression and you're treating with booze, you got depression and addiction. Or if you are suffering from anxiety, you may be cutting or you may be anorexic at the same time. So that's chapter 10. Please read the chapter and view the 2 videos which I've posted. One shows a couple people suffering from depression, and one is sort of an overarching look at this issue of psychological disorders. And when I return next week or the week after next, we'll have our test on the 21st. And then the week after that, after Thanksgiving, we'll cover Chapter 11. And we'll get into Chapter 9, of course, the last week of class. So Chapter 11, we'll talk about treatments for all of these mental illnesses that I've discussed here.